Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Testing Tips and Tools podcast. We're very excited today to have the co-founder and director of sales and marketing at TestDouble, Justin Searls, joining us. Welcome, Justin.
Hello.
And also my co-host, Amit Zor, who is a software engineer at Apple Tools. Hi, Amit.
Hi, Tracy. Happy to be here.
Yes. So, Justin, you have done so much for testing in the testing world, and we are very, very thrilled to have you on this podcast. Do you want to tell us a little bit about, what you're working on right now?
Right now, So I've kind of alongside a lot of our clients have been reinvesting in the Ruby ecosystem the last couple years. So I spent probably 4 or 5 years riding a wave of an increased focus on getting serious about front-end JavaScript and Node.js testing and rigor, I guess, like applying the same levels of code quality to JavaScript as we do in our backend languages. But then in the last year or year and a half or so, we started to see a lot of companies who have like Ruby and Rails in their background start to renovate and reinvest in those applications. And so the last couple years, I've been actually having a lot of fun kind of revisiting my stomping grounds and building new gems and tools that actually bring some of what I've learned from JavaScript back to Ruby. My big project right now is called Standard RB, which is actually just like Standard JS. So if you know Standard for us, a book of DJ basically makes an ESLint configuration under the CLI standard. And the big deal is that you can't configure it. So it's a linter that will stylize all your code, and it's not allowed to be configured. So it kind of removes the bike shedding from the project. And I am porting it back in a sense to Ruby by building the same sort of thing on top of RuboCop, which has been a really fun and interesting project, and is a little bit maybe late to the game, given that Ruby is 25 years old. But it's gotten a lot of support from people in the Ruby community. We're having a lot of fun.
That's really interesting. Are you seeing a lot of? I was talking to somebody else who is in the Ruby community just at lunch today, and he was saying he's been seeing a lot of migrations and people needing the people who do Ruby to kind of help bridge the gap between the front end and Ruby. So a lot of React and Ruby, it seems like right now.
Yep, for sure. We're seeing the same thing.
Interesting. So interesting. Well, good for y'all.
Yeah. So Justin, it sounds really interesting, and I'm happy to hear that it's going the other way for you, actually porting and getting concepts and things from the JavaScript ecosystem into Ruby. So it's as a front-end developer and a JavaScript enthusiast, I'm happy to hear that. So I was wondering, you have a pretty broad angle on the industry as the co-founder of TestDouble and seeing a lot of companies and seeing a lot of the industry. So first of all, I'd like to know a little bit more about what TestDouble is doing and what things you are seeing, and also how are you viewing the market with regards to testing? Do you see a lot of companies struggle with this issue? How do you get them jump started? What's your angle on the whole thing?
Yeah, sure. So a little background: TestDouble is a development studio consultancy agency. We're a bunch of consultants who build custom software kind of hand in glove with our clients' engineering team. So we're like, even though we're all remote and distributed and all over the place, we join our customers' teams as just additional engineers to get stuff done. But then our kind of our secret double agent mission is to try to figure out ways that we can make the whole team better. Our goal is to leave every team better than we found it somehow. And that's different for every company. So kind of to your point, we see different trends. We also have a particular, I think, perspective or ideology about what about the software industry, like what it's like to use software, how we build software, how we all talk about software. We have a lot of, I think, pretty strong perspective on the sort of things that can be improved. And testing and quality are one of those, right? Because I think that there's still a sort of overly you might call it like analogous to like manufacturing or remodeling or like construction contracting, this approach that a lot of businesses have towards building custom software, where they think it's just like a matter of listing out 500 bullet points of all the things that they want their software to do, and then they put it out to bid, and then everyone kind of gives their 3-point estimates for each of those 500 things, and that all rolls up into how much your software is going to cost. But then that's how you end up with monstrosities like healthcare.gov that don't actually work when you plug them all together again. And one of our big focuses is on how to make software something that is much more, I think, true to its nature of, it's just automating a computer while also writing it in such a way that other people can understand it and kind of pick up the ball and iterate with it, and working in really, really tight feedback loops. And so I think a lot of our work is really focused on making software a more humane experience for everyone involved, less scary for business people and more safe and inclusive for developers. That's taken us on a whole slew of adventures to all kinds of different clients, because this is a problem that's universal to everybody who makes custom software. And so that, to your question, kind of gets me and the whole team at TestDouble a lot of insight into what are the trends and what are people doing. And one of them that I think is probably relevant to this podcast, because Applitools has been so successful in large organizations and in helping to empower QA professionals. One of them that I'm really interested in digging in with you all is sort of the future of the QA role, because one of the things that we see is a sort of continued pressure or tension as developers start writing their own tests, and they get more and more competent and kind of maintaining all of their test automation successfully in even large and complicated organizations. It can really kind of put the squeeze on QA developers and QA engineers and QA professionals to kind of carve out like what is their role in the organization, and how to be a first-class citizen on a cross-functional team, and how to contribute the most value. And that's one of the kind of hot button issues that we're starting to see time and again at some of our larger clients.
So that's super interesting. So any insights so far? Because I can totally relate to the challenge there with the trend.
Yeah, I think that the big one is we're very focused when we talk about testing or when we talk about quality. We really don't like, we don't like the word quality because it's so amorphous. And in a lot of organizations, when people start using the word quality, they really just use it as a cudgel to kind of browbeat other people into submission. They talk about it in terms of control, like preventing bad things from happening or understanding why bad things happened after the fact, and not so much thinking about what a lot of QA professionals I talk to care a lot more about, which is like building the right thing in the first place and with a thoughtful kind of design and approach. So a lot of these kind of remediation efforts are never necessary. And so when I talk to my QA friends, the ones that I think struggle the most is with dealing with organizations that see QA as sort of like a necessary component of a team to kind of rein them in and prevent bad things from slipping through, kind of like a sieve at the end of a process. And it's become, I think, increasingly my perception that we have really, really failed QA professionals as organizations to articulate for them that like the point at the end of the day is to make sure that what we're building succeeds for our business and is great for customers to use, That's the result-oriented kind of perspective that matters. But instead, almost every single QA department that I see is just sort of got like gobs and gobs and gobs of all of this automation testing. Maybe they're, they started as exploratory testers, but now like they spend 40 plus hours a week just trying to maintain gigantic Cucumber test suites, or other automation suites. And the stuff that was supposed to kind of remove the drudgery from their experience of asserting that the software is good has kind of taken over the entire job, to the point where they don't really learn anything from them. They're just trying to keep all these builds green, and it becomes a much more adversarial role. And I think that we're just starting to see this kind of come to a head in a lot of organizations.
Yeah, so this, this brings up two points for me, which I'd really like to dive in. One was also related to a previous one, which is the human angle, and this is starting to be a motif in our podcast, dealing with humans in the world of software development. But touching to the point of QA, I totally relate. I want to say that in companies I worked at, actually the role of QA was indeed kind of ambiguous, in that part of their role was to actually be sort of gatekeepers of quality, which is not a good role to be in. And there's a whole discussion to be made about ownership of quality, which, as you hinted, really lies on the responsibility lies on each part of the organization, starting from actually defining the product with a good quality, and then developing it with good quality, and then releasing it through the door as a quality product. But then they had also another role of making sure that the things click together and integrate nicely and work as a product, because a lot of times QA is like the point in the pipeline that can actually use the product. They're the first ones to get the product, and then comment on some workflows and things that make sense or don't make sense, which is arguable because it's kind of late in the process. It's already been developed, so it's kind of weird to provide feedback at that late point in the process. So there's a lot of optimization, I think, that is to be made when developing software, and defining where the ownership on quality lies.
Yeah, I think it's kind of unfair sometimes when companies design teams and they're like, all right, well, you're the developer, you own the code, and you're the product owner, and you own the backlog, and you're the business analyst, and you own these requirements, and you're the QA person, so you own that it's all good, right? That's putting a lot on somebody, and that's not really fair. So, like, here's an example. We had a client who, somebody here we know and we trust for a long time, and they said, hey, we spent the last 10 years, all of our developers really leveling up the quality with which they write code. And our developers now are writing great automation tests. And it's made our QA people feel like second-class citizens, because it's now forced them to kind of question like what their role is. Like, some of them are comfortable writing Cucumber tests, and many of them aren't, and they kind of feel ham-fisted, and that like they just feel like a ton of pressure to keep all these builds green, but it feels redundant because the developers are writing their own tests. And it took us a long time to ultimately arrive to what I think is probably pretty good general advice, which is that if you have a mature engineering organization, you should probably be able to expect at this point in, the year 2019, that developers will, write decent, unit tests and decent integration tests or functional tests that like their system basically works through the happy path. And if you can buy that much, then you can kind of focus on two different roles within what we now call QA. Like QA could be seen as, one, QA people who just only focus on exploratory testing and only focus on like the kind of, does this software meet the kind of, promise or the proposed value, so that they kind of follow things along for the whole lifespan of a feature, and they just make sure that everything we're delivering to is delivering on that promise. And then the second half of this QA role you might call quality engineering, which is a much more, I think, disciplined and a more explicitly technical kind of cross-team or enterprise-wide, capacity, where even in like a pretty big organization of a couple hundred engineers, maybe you just have 2 or 3 like full-time capital D developers who are in a position to maintain a single, test suite that verifies that, yes, when all of our systems are plugged together in a production-like experience, things seem to work. And the tricky bit about that is, you can't just do what so many organizations do and add test after test after test until like you're so successful that 3 years from now you have like a 9-hour build and you're constantly remediating. Like I think on day one, these sorts of organizations need to be much more thoughtful about budgeting. Like, all right, you got a 20-minute budget maybe to verify that a particular build is safe to go out. So like we're gonna cram in the highest priority 20 minutes worth of automation that we can muster. And if we can't get something to fit in 20 minutes, either we got to speed things up, paralyze things, or let another test kind of drop off of what we build each time. And what we found is that in organizations we sort of given this kind of advice to, it's been super relieving and clarifying to let QA people, kind of sort into, a full-blown technical role that's kind of given all the expectations of just like, this is what you own and maintain and curate and build, or a full-blown kind of like, business user quality role, which is not expected to be, being like sort of like a jack of all trades and also building automation tests.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense, because if you see QA as, your role is to, make sure that we're releasing a quality product, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a step after development that says you need to check manually the product. It says, it might as well mean just what you say. Your role is to create an infrastructure that our tests, which we define as covering, have a good coverage, can run in a timely manner, and produce the level of assurance that we're releasing something good quality. So I think, yeah, it kind of shifts the perspective and the point of view on what QA really means. So it's really nice. So if you go to a company that doesn't already have tests, so they're not yet in that place, and that they need to change something fundamental in the way they work. How do you get them to start to create a testing culture, a testing strategy?
We've had a couple engagements this year with companies that have just brilliant engineers, but just happen to not have the collective experience of, writing automated tests. And so they all care a great deal, and they build, important, working, valid, great software. But they came to us kind of asking, where to get started with testing. And, in each of these cases, we walked away with highly contextual, what I think are well-reasoned kind of like proposed test suites and testing activities and sort of, commitments from the team on like what they were going to try to pick up and learn. But the most important thing at every single step was to make sure that everybody was bought in on the same page with like, what's the return on investment that we want to see here? Because one thing that tends not to work very well, unless you like testing for testing's sake, is to just sort of issue an edict that like, well, testing is inherently good and we should all be doing it. And if we don't do it, that means you're a bad programmer. And if you don't do it, you should feel shame or you should feel guilt. And we're just going to keep on, repeating these messages until morale improves, right? And that's just not a fair way to run any kind of business. And to be honest, some of our, most difficult client engagements have been cases where they, are never willing to delete a test or never willing to question the value of a test or a testing activity. Because in the grand scheme of things, our tests serve, should be tools that serve us. that should help us ship better production software faster, better. If we can manually check the system 10 times as easily as run the test suite, then that should give us all pause, right? So, that's one reason why when people approach us for testing advice, we're pretty careful to start with understanding the constraints that the current team is under, understanding like what are the failure modes, like how often do bugs get into production, or how scared are you to change particular parts of the system, or how long does it take? Is it taking longer and longer, for example, to ship similarly sized features to what you were shipping 6 months ago or a year ago? And only once we have an understanding of the pain that they're experiencing do we start to propose different testing strategies that you might employ to actually address a real pain that the team all agrees that they're experiencing. Does that make sense?
It makes huge sense, if that's even a phrase. But yeah, it does. It's what I'm hearing is taking a pragmatic approach and removing a lot of FUD from the process and the ceremonies and the whole cargo cult around testing, and taking it a level down from just words into how does this fit in your workflows, answer your needs, and can be pragmatically applied within your constraints of the organization, and where exactly do the pains exist. So it's sort of a research, a relieving research process that's going to start through the organization, which sounds really positive.
Yeah, I agree. The problem, I think, with this approach is that while it is completely honest and solutions focused, the fact that it's pragmatic, the fact that it says like, do things that are good for you, that seem to be working, and don't do things that are seemingly useless pain, is that if you're a developer and you're just learning, maybe your team's attempting to learn test-driven development, or maybe your team's just trying to build a good test suite, and if a thought leader or a consultant tells you, hey, it may be okay to delete tests, or hey, there are certain cases where TDD doesn't work very well, and you as a developer who's new to testing, the going is going to get tough because testing well is really, really hard. And so when the going gets tough, now you're at this crossroads. You have to ask yourself, is it hard because I haven't learned it yet? Or is it hard because this is one of those cases that Justin told us where testing maybe isn't really worth the ROI? And it's impossible for a person in that situation to know the answer to that question independently, right? And so that's one reason why we've landed at the sort of consulting model that we have, because like what you really need is just somebody who's seen it before and been through that experience to kind of shepherd you through it. But absent that, it does require, I think, a sort of explicit permission structure for the team to just double down and just do it the hard way, and maybe like go full bore. We're going to test drive absolutely everything, no matter what, and zero exceptions for a month or 2 months. And maybe out the other end, we'll have learned so much that we'll have some, better perspective on like when not to do it, or better understand the trade-offs. But if you start making those trade-off decisions too early, you might actually just be compromising the value that you could otherwise be seeing, right? So it's one of those tricky areas where until you have the expertise, you can't necessarily chart your own ideal course forward.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. It's it sounds like a standard learning process where you need to exercise in order to learn, and you can't get it right the first time. You have to go through the process. And it does make a lot of sense to just let people be comfortable on making errors and not feel that they have to do the right thing with every decision, but they have to learn for themselves. And through the discussions, at the end of the tunnel, they're going to get it right for them, which sounds really right, and that's actually programmatic.
And if it requires a team or a company or a business to be at a moment and a position where they can afford to go slow for a little bit. If you're managing a team of 6 developers and it's you're planning to make this a 5-year or 10-year investment,
Yeah.
going taking the lighter load of what features you plan on shipping in the next quarter so that the team can kind of coalesce around stronger practices, not just testing, but whatever the case is. That's a decision that is hard to make and hard to justify in a lot of organizations. But as well as a strange number, like 6 of the people at Testable currently, we were all on the same project together. It was where we originally met several of each other in 2009. And that team had made a sort of a contract. We literally all signed it. We wrote it up and we signed it. Document saying we were going to just shoot for 100% code coverage. We were going to test drive every single line of code. And as soon as we couldn't, it took consent of the entire team to make exceptions to this long list of stuff that we were going to strive to do. And nobody on the team actually had that experience, right? Of really seriously undertaking and doing this before. But because they were all smart people and because we were really earnest and we were trying really hard, we put in a lot of time, to be honest. It was tough and it was really painful and it was really hard. But we had the support of the people around us, and came out the other end. And now, I look at that half a dozen developers that I worked with, and we have a sort of a fluency with our ability to speak with one another and understand these topics on such a deep level that I struggle to find with anyone else when I'm talking, especially about testing, but also about object-oriented design or functional design. And sometimes you just have to make that kind of team-wide commitment early on and really hold yourselves to it to facilitate the kind of learning that you collectively want, but will only make if you're holding each other accountable.
Yep. Yep. I think that that resonates very, very well, and is pretty deep. I think I don't hold coverage as a metric, and I don't. So correct me if I'm wrong. So the point of having 100% coverage is just as an exercise for a team to work together towards creating a culture, and not actually aiming for that metric also on the long run and preserving that 100% coverage, but just doing it the 100% removes a lot of questions from the process and makes you focus on what exactly the goal is.
Yeah, I mean, if you're shooting for 80%, say. And there's nothing wrong with any of these numbers. The only thing wrong, in my opinion, is when they're used as a means of trying to control other people or judge other people, based on metrics. Because it's easy after the fact, if you see some project with low code coverage, to swoop into a room and to say oh, well, clearly these people didn't care about testing, but you weren't in the room, right? Who knows all of the situations or pressures that team might have experienced that led them to where they are today. Because if you're on a team, no matter where you are, when everyone looks back, it's completely understandable how you got there. And so I'm 100% uncomfortable with people imposing or people outside the team room measuring and pushing for specific metrics that are internal or intrinsic in nature to the team's work. The team should really own that, and they should be pretty, I think, collectively bought in on the purpose behind either committing to or even tracking and measuring any given metric. And if you don't have that, just don't do it. But yes, to your point, if you shoot for 100%, it's going to force a lot of really good conversations when you can't do it. If you shoot for 80%, then you can kind of just cut corners willy-nilly, and it becomes sort of a negotiation. So there's I think there's a sort of beauty in absolutism, especially when you're talking about as a learning exercise. And nowadays, when I write my own little libraries, if I plan on that library sticking around for a while, like I mentioned standard RB, the gem that like consistently lints Ruby code without configuration, I am pretty sure if you go and download that and you run rake test, that I've got 100% code coverage, or darn close, like 99.7, because of some weird configuration thing. And I just wrote that by myself and mostly in a couple of weekends. So it's attainable, but like the reason that I did that was I wanted to make sure that I had everything, all of my ducks in a row. If anyone were to send me a pull request, that I could be certain that like if the build passed, it probably was safe. I would definitely view it like a constraint, just like timeline and budget and anything else. It's up to the team to decide what they think is going to pay off for them over the long term.
Great. So I think in this conversation, you've shed a lot of light, Justin, on what challenges organizations are going to meet if they want to instill a testing culture within the organization, and what walls are they going to hit. And I think there's a lot of priceless information just sitting there. So thanks about that. A shift of subject. So I've seen your talk, Please Don't Mock Me. And that was pretty eye-opening in the level of resolution and high fidelity that you've given the subject of mocking. So can you tell us a little bit about this subject?
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of background first. So I think that mocking libraries are a fascinating subject because they are very useful things that can help you take a test that is maybe you have code that's hard to test, or maybe you have a bunch of tests, but they're not really like super clearly organized. And you could either set up all the objects that you needed in order to test the thing that you're testing, or you could just kind of like punch a hole in reality by using a mocking framework and get to like a nitty gritty specific little line of code and like make sure that little line of code is doing the thing that you want, so that you can check a box and say that things are testing. So like I think that by the way, none of those things are, I think, good ways to use mocking libraries, because what they are is they're affordances, or they're accommodations for problematic scenarios that teams find themselves in all the time. Like writing code that's hard to test means that you've written code that's hard to invoke or hard to use. So the root cause problem is in the code, not in the test. So you shouldn't be looking for a testing tool. You should be looking at like, what can I do to refactor this code or make this code easier to call, so that then the test becomes this buttery smooth thing. And the functional programming friends of ours would be quick to tell us that probably means more pure functions that just take in arguments and then return values. But instead, because mocking libraries are often not very well explained, and they're not introduced with even readmes that explain the methodology that is intended to go with them, they very often just become these toolkits for actually reducing the level of veracity and integrity that a test can tell us about how a system works. If you rewind the clock and you go back to like the year 2000, when extreme programming was starting to pick up steam, especially in London, you had a couple of people like Nat Price and Steve Freeman starting to develop techniques that used these like fake objects that they coined the term mock. And their goal was to use these initially as a way to explore big legacy code bases, like almost imagine like a gigantic legacy code base like the Death Star, and then you take a little mock object that is tripwired to explode every time like somebody calls it in a way that you don't expect, and then you send that little torpedo deep into the Death Star, and then you let it blow up, and you see what it blows up, and then you can use that as a feedback mechanism to be like, aha, somebody is calling this thing that way in such and such a way, and that's either good or bad, and you use that as a feedback mechanism for these otherwise black box, really hard to parse and introspect systems. Like that was one avenue that a lot of I think JMocket maybe and others started to be developed in the Java sphere. But that's not how most people use mocking libraries today. Another one that I think is even more relevant, because this is how I actually practice test-driven development when I'm on my own time, is same fellows. They wrote a book called Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests. And it's all the examples are in Java. And if all you do is read the first chapter, I think it's brilliant. And everyone should go check this book out. Because what they describe is a universe where you start to think outside in about the system that you're building. And I do get to this. Like, so the talk, Please Don't Mock Me, is like 9 bad ways to abuse mock objects, and then 1 way that I actually recommend you use. And this is the 1 way that I actually use them. And it's a really structured approach to designing systems by first asking, what's the code that I wish I had? Well, I wish I had something that could go and get all this stuff from a database for me. And I wish I had something that could transform all those database records into these API objects. And then I wish I had something that could go and submit this to these 3 APIs. And by just asking those questions, you can write tests by kind of proactively creating mock objects with, good names and with like clear contracts in terms of the parameters that they accept and the values that they return. And you can write a test that specifies the relationship between these 3 things. And you can actually get all of that passing before you've actually implemented any of those 3 things that do the real work for you. But what you've just accomplished is now you have a clear set of abstractions all operating at the same level. You've got a proven contract between the 3 in terms of how data would flow through this particular feature, and you've broken the work up into 3 logical parts. And that's super duper eye-opening, I think, for developers to maybe find themselves working in systems where, you start with a function, then you add a thing, and you add an if and else, and then pretty soon you got a function that's 40 lines long, and then you find yourself 3 months from then asking, like, man, how do we break this down? How do we detangle this? And so this is a way to sort of proactively start, as part of your workflow, pushing down new types and new functions with good names that are clearly organized and well separated, like on day 1. So you never kind of get to this messy state where you're adding and adding and adding. And that approach, which I coined discovery testing, in the specific way that I practice it, has changed my life and changed me as a developer. And even when I don't practice it, I carry forth all of the things that I learned about building small things and how I name things, and learning about pure functions. That I can't recommend enough that people check it out. So that's the name of the book is Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests. And if you want to deep dive into this, in addition to watching my talk, Please Don't Mock Me, that you referenced earlier, I've done like a 4-part screencast series where I implement the Conway's Game of Life game in Java using Eclipse, to just rigorously show, like, here's what this process looks like as you break it down layer by layer. And it's long. I mean, it's like 4 90-minute long screencasts. But that's like, actually not that big of an investment if you're talking about changing, potentially the way that you approach every feature that you build for work. And so we can happily share that in your show notes.
Great. We're about to be wrapping up. So I do want to hear your take, if there is one, about visual testing. I'm curious to know if this is something that you employ as part of your work, or have you checked out this workflow of also doing visual testing?
I think, what Applitools builds, what Percy builds, I think these are super duper valuable and intelligent tools, and they address a need that I think is underserved by tools that seem similar but are actually quite different. When Selenium was brand new, it started as a Firefox plugin that was like a record playback tool, and you'd hit record and you'd click all over a website, and it would build this kind of auto-generated, barely human readable script of actions. And basically what it did was, if anything changed ever, it would blow up, it would break. But the problem with software is, like, it is changing all the time, and so it's gonna break. And if you can't read the test, then you can't necessarily reconcile Like, was that a good and meaningful change or a bad one? And so you end up just re-recording it and never really learning. And a similar, and this is years ago, right? That's a decade ago. But a similar new thing is really popular in the form of React snapshot testing, where people will build either a whole website in React or just a single component, and they'll associate with that component some snapshot test of like, when I do this, then the DOM will look exactly like this, and it gets generated for you, and you commit it to your repository, and then you go about your business and you change things, and you run the snapshot test, and you're like, hey, did you change stuff? And like you hit one, I changed stuff, and then it'll just like dump a new DOM, and then you'll just kind of blindly commit that as well. But like you look at these snapshots, no one's really reading them, no one's scrutinizing them and evaluate, like making sure maybe something in that DOM snapshot disappeared and it was really important and your change made it stop working. But like, because we don't understand that, it's really, really risky to rely on it for literally anything. It's just kind of like, it gives you a sense of security with no benefit. But when you look at image regression tools, like Applitools and like Percy, anybody can understand. You don't have to be a developer to understand it, because you're literally answering the question, does this look right? Is anything missing from this screen? Is this information here? And even little things like, like where we position the word email above or below besides this form element, that matters to somebody, and it moved. So was that an okay move or a not okay move? Like, these are really, really actually valuable tools because they operate at a level that humans understand. And most snapshot related tests and record playback and other stuff that's sort of like low effort, high output testing, like image regression testing can be, most of that other stuff just doesn't operate at that level that's understandable. And so it can't be maintained easily. So that's why I think that these are great tools to have when you're trying to find a way to get some good test coverage that assures you that like stuff is still working as things change. And it can really buy your team a lot of flexibility in understanding like, what are their remaining responsibilities that they do want to test themselves with automation testing.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah. It's been so interesting, Justin, to hear you talk, because when we talk to testing people, it's from so many different angles, but you've been sort of at the lower level. You've been doing testing sort of like in the front end space as well. And then you've been able to give us a really high level summary of kind of what happens in the sort of like as you go higher up, right? Like in the more architect level conversation. So it's like talking to three people at once because you have all those experiences.
I never set out to be, maybe it's because of this, but I didn't set out to be a testing guy. Like what I set out to do is just, I care a lot about getting the details right. And on every team for seemingly a decade, I just cared a little bit more about testing than everyone else around me. And that kind of slotted me into this role. And so I'm grateful for that because it's given me a lot of perspective and a lot of empathy for people who do focus strictly on testing or specialize on testing. Because as primarily by trade, I'm a developer. I think that we could only benefit from a greater understanding of these different specialties and greater empathy for one another, so we can help set each other up for success and cooperation, as opposed to what we referred to earlier in the call, which is almost the default setting for a lot of enterprises is an adversarial relationship between QA and developers, and that's just setting yourself up for conflict.
Yeah, definitely. It's I really like that though. It's like you shouldn't think of testing as testing. You should think of testing kind of as just wanting to build really good quality software, or maybe not quality because you don't like that word, but good software, focusing on the details, which in essence becomes good software. So, well, thank you so much for chatting with us. Where can we find you on the internet?
Well, on the internet, I'm most prolific if in a low fidelity form on Twitter, where my last name Searls, Searls, is my handle. If you want to learn more about Test Double, we are TEST double.com, and we got a landing page and everything and ways to get a hold of us. And if you'd like to email me, you can just, you can probably guess my email is justin@testdouble.com. I really appreciate the time today. I think this was a good, important conversation. And most of all, I love the work that Applitools is doing. I think it's a great product that's helping a lot of people.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. And you can find Amit on Twitter as well at Amit Zur, which is really easy, AMITZUR, and myself, Tracy, at Lady Leet, LADYLEET. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode, and we'll see you on the next one.